The whites were always trying to make the Indians give up their life and live like white men, to go to farming, work hard, and they did not want to anyway. If the Indians had tried to make the white live like them, the whites would have resisted, as it was the same way with many Indians. Wamditonka, Big Eagle of the Santee Sioux. That above quote clearly means that if the natives were in the same position as the whites and vice versa, that they would have reacted the same way. The natives never tried to force the whites to live the way they did, but the whites always tried to make the natives live the way the whites did. So you've read a little bit about the history of Native America and how we see that there are many, many problems after the Civil War. Two struggles Native Americans might have faced. They might have faced the fear that they were Americans moving westward. They might fear that these Americans were not stopping in Oregon, but they were stopping in the territories where they lived. They were also struggling to see why are all of these blacks and Irish immigrants moving westward as well. Another big argument was, well, if these people are going to come west, they're obviously going to start hunting. So who are they going to start hunting, or what are they going to start hunting? They're going to start hunting the buffalo and the animals that the natives relied on. Another struggle they might have faced was the fact that they really didn't know if Americans were going to move westward or if they were going to be left alone. Those are just some of those struggles. In 1864, as you can see here on the map, in the southeastern corner of Colorado right now, there was a massacre at the Sand Creek River, or the Big Sandy Creek, excuse me. There were a number of Americans who had moved into the area, but really it was controlled by the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, who lived in this Colorado territory. Really, what had happened at Sand Creek was a massacre. As you read here, the Cheyenne had little warning of the attack, where roughly 230 men, women, and children were killed. It was even noted by one American soldier, hundreds of women and children were coming towards us on their knees for mercy, but we shot their brains out. It was a true massacre because of what the soldiers did to the bodies, of what they did to the women and children, of how there was zero resistance. And yet they fought and killed these people along the Sand Creek. Now, if you think about this, the headlines back east in like New York, Chicago, and Boston, they probably looked at this and said one of two things. One, oh my gosh, Native children and Native women, innocent civilians are being slaughtered. Or the newspapers did not publish those details. The newspapers often published great victory against the Indians of the West. And so in looking at this, yes, it was a massacre because there were innocent women and children killed. But back east in the big cities, it might not have been portrayed that way in the news. Looking at this account of the Sand Creek Massacre, it's pretty fascinating, showing that this is how the natives kept track of these events, because they didn't have written language. This is another recording of an event in Native American history. And again, so question 4, what do you think was the purpose of recording these events if no future generations were able to read? Well, if you don't draw the events, then no one's going to be able to know how to picture the events. And because Native American history is more of an oral history, spoken by word, these drawings tell the story of what went on. The different animals involved, the different people on the horses, right? If there were dances or if there were soldiers fighting or whatnot. So this is the way the natives sent their history generation to generation on the backs of buffalo hides and on the backs of other animal hides and skins. Now, the Fetterman Massacre in 1866 was a big deal for the sake that in 1866, Red Cloud of the Sioux said to the government, "Give us something in return. All you do is come in and walk along the trail and take and take and take." And so what had happened in this Wyoming territory was the Bozeman Trail, which was also a part of the Oregon Trail at the time. The Bozeman Trail made its way up into northern Wyoming and then into southern Montana, where there were gold fields. Now, one reason the Fetterman Massacre was good and bad, you have to think about it from both sides. Okay? Crazy Horse of the Native Americans led this military campaign against the Americans. And what they had really done was they had outsmarted the Americans. It says that over 2,000 Native Americans fired 40,000 arrows that rained down on the soldiers, because the soldiers did not know exactly where the natives were, nor did they know how many natives there were. And so it proved that the natives weren't just these simple-minded people living on the plains that didn't know how to fight. They had been fighting for thousands of years, and they had been warring with other tribes for hundreds of years. And so it was obvious that the natives were able to fight. They just had to use their tactics against a new enemy, American white soldiers. Now, yes, 81 men are killed, the soldiers. The response to the massacre, it was great because it showed the natives could defeat the Americans. It was good because it showed the Native Americans were a force that could defeat these soldiers with their guns. The soldiers that had the guns, that is. Now, one of the bad things, if you think about it, this news goes back east. The American government likely not happy. The American government likely going to send more soldiers, send more weapons. So every single victory by the natives was also a defeat, because it was also a sign that the natives were willing to fight against the army, and if the army sent more, they were still going to fight. And as the army sent more, they were still willing to fight. Now, in this sense, who benefits more from this massacre? In the short term, it's likely the Sioux. It's likely Red Cloud and the Sioux and Crazy Horse, because they were victorious against the Americans. But if you think long term, as there were more and more defeats of the U.S. soldiers by the natives, that meant that Americans were going to send more and more soldiers, and they weren't going to be peaceful with these natives. They were going to try to kill and relocate and destroy the native population. In 1868, at Fort Laramie, there was a treaty. This treaty was signed in an attempt to figure out who is going to live where on these reservations. Now, one of these men, that's William Tecumseh Sherman, who is at the treaty, sitting in front of the Native Americans, discussing what these tribes were going to do and where they were going to live. So in 1868, you see the meeting at Fort Laramie, and so then the following reservations are going to be created. The Rosebud Reservation, the Pine Ridge Reservation, called the Great Sioux Reservation, the Black Hills, where there would be gold discovered by the Americans, the Standing Rock Reservation, and the Cheyenne River Basin Reservation. Now, the Fort Laramie Treaty was a tremendous success for the Americans for a number of reasons. Why? Because if you look right here, it shows that the natives were not allowed to hunt or travel or settle wherever they wanted. Now the natives are confined to an area. Now the natives are forced to stay in an area. Now the natives have been told by the government that they cannot go places. So if you think about it, this is really one of the first times that the Americans are saying, listen, this is what you're going to do, and this is what we're going to do, and you have to abide by these rules. Whereas the United States is not always going to abide by these rules. Now, in a sense, the United States is taking advantage of the natives because they realize that they have the advantage over them, that they could get the natives to rely on the Americans for goods. And so if you could get the natives to rely on you, then you could win.
I didn't get that.
Oh, shut up, Siri. I didn't mean to click on you. I'm sure you're all going to laugh at that. Now, Based on the reading, another one of the reasons why this was successful for the Americans, well, all of these things were promised, but they never really came. They never received all of these buildings. They never received all of these goods. And especially to the Sioux, who were traditionally nomadic hunters who followed the buffalo, well, now you're being told you can't follow the buffalo. You can only follow the buffalo on these parts of your land. You can't go outside of these borders. That doesn't necessarily mean the buffalo will be able to be in those borders. You also have to think about the geography. Massive mountain ranges here on the Great Sioux Reservation, very much barren land here on the reservations. I had you watch a film about the Exodusters. Not a lot of people think about what happened to freed blacks after the war. A lot of freed blacks went into Kansas, went into Nebraska, moved westward. Why? To escape persecution. They wanted a new life. They thought, this is great. We will be able to leave the South, leave oppression, leave racism, and go create our own lives and create our own ways and be away from what was a nation of slavery. And now we are free from bondage, so we can live out here. We can do as we want. They were called Exodusters. I particularly like that name because the word Exodus comes out of it, and duster meaning, well, it's the Great Plains is really home to nothing but dust and dirt at the time. So they're the ones that fled to go westward. We started the Native American unit with this quote, but I very much enjoy it. My father was the first to see through the schemes of the white man. He said, my son, when I am gone, you are the chief of these people. Always remember that your father never sold his country. This country holds your father's body. Never sell the bones of your father and mother. I pressed my father's hand and told him I would protect his grave with my life. A man who would not love his father's grave is worse than a wild animal. And he is saying, do everything you can to protect the land and do not barter with the Americans. Do not give up this land. This is sacred land where your father and mother are buried. Now, I asked y'all to also take a look at some of the quotes on the wall, to which we'll discuss in class. But you'll notice that these quotes are either directed towards Americans or towards natives, or they are about the way the natives interacted with the Americans, or the way the Americans interacted with the natives. The Transcontinental Railroad, easily the largest industrial feat in American history. The Central Pacific had between 15,000 and 20,000 Chinese immigrants working on the railroad. Why did Americans feel the Chinese were such great workers? What were the difficulties Chinese immigrants faced working on the railroad? Most Chinese workers remained in America after building the railroad. Why do you think they wanted to stay? This is hard. Now, why do Americans feel the Chinese are such great workers? They worked for cheap, they worked hard, they had a strong work ethic. And this is going to sound silly, but Americans figured, well, the Chinese built the Great Wall of China. They could easily build a railroad. And the Chinese invented dynamite. You know, they could, or not dynamite, gunpowder. They could work with explosives. This is what they've done. And so that was the really big concept. Difficulties, obviously racism, obviously persecution, obviously getting paid less. And they had to kind of create their own culture, and they had to create their own neighborhoods, and they had to create their own areas in the United States. In this, actually, it's really territories. California is the only state at this time. They're building the railroad through Nevada, Utah, Colorado. I mean, this isn't where, these are not states yet. Colorado, 1876, Utah, 1896, Nevada, 1863. So Nevada is a state at that time. Now, another problem or another difficulty they faced, I guarantee you the Chinese were given the most difficult jobs because they were seen as less than Americans. They were foreign with their foreign cultures, their different ways of life. Now, why did some of them stay? Just like any other reason why an immigrant would stay. Opportunity, the ability to carve out their own life, have their own lifestyle. Made sense. Economically, the Chinese did very well with their ways of life, selling their style of food, their ways of life, their hygiene. I mean, it actually changed the way a lot of the Western people lived. The Chinese were a very clean group of people. I know this is going to sound silly, but they bathed regularly. They drank tea and they had a healthier diet. They worked longer. They were healthier. So therefore, yeah, they were better workers. So that was another reason why the Chinese decided to stay, was because they realized that their way of life in America was successful for them. And it offered jobs. The Transcontinental Railroad was one of the nation's most incredible industrial achievements. 6 effects of the Transcontinental Railroad. How do you think the natives responded? A lot going on. So, 6 effects. Obviously, there's more industry, the spread of the railroads, which then also leads to more trading of goods west to east. Faster travel from west to east. More jobs created to build the railroads. Now you need to settle and create towns along the sides of the railroads. You can't just have a railroad that goes across the United States and that's it. You have to create towns and settlements along the railroads. You also have a massive group of migrants moving westward, and they're going to be the ones settling. They're going to be the ones who are moving into this territory. Another, well, you're now going to see more industry in the West. And so with these settlements, we're now going to see that the United States is going to be more settled. It also unites the country. If you think about it, West meeting East, instead of something being traveled that took months, now it takes just over a week, about 10 days. No longer do you have to rely on wagon trains. Now, you've got rail. You've got a faster, more efficient way of traveling across the country. Now goods will be cheaper. More business will be spread. The United States will spread out. But the natives feared the railroad. They called it the Iron Horse. One of the Sioux said that the site of the American Railroad looked like a white man's pipe. And the white man's pipe just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until eventually it took over the land, until eventually it moved all the buffalo, and eventually took over the natives' way of life. Because the railroad did relocate Native Americans. The railroad did kill off the buffalo. The railroad did affect Native American culture. So there were a lot of negative effects of this as well. Now, I like this picture in particular. It's a subtle reminder of race. There isn't a single Chinese person in this picture. There isn't a single black in this picture. It's all white men in this picture. Even though thousands of Chinese people and thousands of freed blacks and thousands of poor immigrants built the railroad. They were the ones that physically constructed the railroad. They're the ones that laid the track, blew up the mountains, slept in tents along the side of the railroad. They did the dirty work, building the bridges, getting the food to feed all of the people working on it. So it's a lot. The Transcontinental Railroad, probably one of the most incredible industrial feats in all of the Western Hemisphere, and had one of the most significant effects on both Native and American people. Last and not least, the land of reservations. In 1875, the United States starts drawing up more and more and more reservations. Now you have to understand, these natives are being forced off of their land and being relocated into an area where they are forced to live. Because of this, the United States, they're not giving the lands that the natives once settled. They're not giving the best of lands. They're just giving them land. If you pay attention to the map, Nevada is pretty much all desert. Part of Montana and Idaho is all mountains. This part of Wyoming is barren land. This part of Arizona, this part of New Mexico and Utah and Colorado is barren land. This part of the Dakotas, again, barren land, not good farmland, not good land where the buffalo travel. So also, if you think about this, the natives never really get to live on land that they had originally lived on. They were confined to land. And so if you think about what states west of Iowa have had Indian reservations, South Dakota is one of the largest, Arizona is one of the largest, Montana, Washington, one of the largest. And the North Dakota, this was the way natives were forced to live. And it's one of the reasons why native culture died so quickly, was because they were forced to live in these areas against their will. I'm going to stop us there.